10 days before the holidays, in a small Pennsylvania town, a new mother is excited by her baby's first Christmas. But when they disappear without a trace, the holiday turns tragic. Investigators suspect her husband is somehow responsible. But with little evidence, they called on the FBI to find the answers before time ran out for the missing mother and child.
A woman and her infant son vanish. The husband is frantic. The clues are scarce, but hopes linger, even as the hours and days tick by without a word. Was she on the run or the victim of foul play? I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It was an investigation filled with blind alleys and dead ends. In order to go forward, we had to revisit the past.
Catasauqua, Pennsylvania, 1 hour north of Philadelphia. A quiet, blue-collar town, a safe place to raise a family. By December 15th, 1994, the town was preparing for the holiday season. The house at 740 Front Street was already decorated. Inside, 26-year-old Joann Katrinak, happily married and a new mother, was especially excited about the holidays. It would be the first Christmas for her 4-month-old son, Alex. Joann and her mother-in-law, Veronica, planned to spend the day at a nearby mall. Now Joann called to say that Alex was dressed and ready. They'd be right over. Joann wanted to find the perfect gift for her husband, Andy. They'd been married less than 2 years. And though they didn't have a lot of money, Joann had been saving for the holiday. Before Joann had met Andy, she had had some bad relationships. Her first husband was abusive. The marriage had ended in divorce. But she was happy now. Her husband, Andy Katrinak, came home a little after 6 o'clock that evening. He was self-employed as a contractor and sometimes worked long hours. Before he'd met Joann, Andy had been a confirmed bachelor. But it seemed that finding this kind and beautiful woman had changed his life. Usually, Joann and Alex were waiting for him when he came home. But not tonight. That didn't seem to worry Andy. After all, it was Christmas time and the mall traffic would be heavy. He saw that Joann had left some chicken to defrost. He settled in to relax and wait for his family. An hour went by, then another. Still, Andy didn't seem concerned. He watched TV and drank another beer. At 8 p.m., Andy finally decided to check on his wife. His first call was to his mother, Veronica.
Hi, Mom. You seen Joann?
He knew Joann had planned to shop with her.
Well, it's,
But now his mother
now.
said Joann had never come by.
No, well, did you didn't
Nor
hear
had
from
she
her?
answered her phone calls.
Well, no, she didn't. That's why I'm calling you, because I hadn't seen her. I hadn't heard from her yet. No. Well, what'd you guys do?
Veronica was worried. She said she and her husband, Andrew Sr., would be right over. While he waited for his parents, Andy checked the house to see if anything was amiss. In the basement, he found the door leading outside, open. A door he and Joann never used. The lock had been pried away from the door frame. Andy immediately called the police. Two officers from the Catasauqua Police Department responded. By then, Andy's parents had arrived. Andy told police the events of the day. The shopping trip that never happened. The apparent disappearance of Joann and little Alex.
Taken this year.
He claimed they had been abducted,
So.
and officers agreed that was a possibility.
She and the baby were supposed to pick me up.
But it was also
we got that
plausible
done
that
last
Joann
week.
had left on her own and taken her child with her.
Well, yeah.
Or maybe Andy had somehow been involved.
She didn't hear from her. She was supposed to meet with her.
Veronica described her phone call with Joann and the subsequent calls that went unanswered.
I had my coat on and waited, and she never showed up.
Here, you guys see this?
Andy now showed police the padlock that had been broken off the basement door.
Yeah.
But the officers were not convinced it was related to the missing mother and child. That night, Andy stayed home by the phone while his father searched the surrounding area for Joann and Alex. At 3 in the morning, Andrew Sr. had found something and brought his son to see it.
What is this?
Joann's tan Toyota was backed into a spot in the parking lot of McCarty's Tavern,
What is this?
down the street from the Katrinak's home.
That's her keys, Andy.
Inside were Joann's keys and her small canister of mace. Again, Andy called Catasauqua police. This time, police suspected foul play. But the local force lacked the resources and experience needed to lead the investigation. So they contacted Pennsylvania state troopers for assistance. With the possibility of an abduction, Major Robert Wirtz looked to the most likely suspect, Joann's husband, Andy Katrinak.
There was a lot of looking into the family life and looking at what Andrew did on that particular day and those sorts of things. One of the things that you're always forced to do in these types of investigations is look at family members.
State police arrived at Andy's house the next morning.
You see that right there?
Andy told them that overnight he had noticed something else. A cut phone line in the basement.
Crime scene down here?
One of two separate phone lines in the house.
And I left it for you.
The one cut serviced the cordless phone, while the other serviced the kitchen phone. It appeared to investigators that whoever cut the line knew where to look and which one to cut. State police evidence technicians also found a partial boot print on the basement floor and tool marks on the door frame where the padlock was pried off.
Laundry upstairs. No, she didn't come down.
As crime scene technicians checked the house, they found nothing to remove suspicion from Andy. In the master bedroom, there was no indication Joann had packed for a long trip. Andy confirmed that his wife's clothes all seemed to be in the closet, and the couple's suitcases were under the bed where he said they always kept them. Technicians found no blood or other signs of foul play. They dusted for fingerprints around the room's entry points, but found only Andy's and Joann's. In the baby's room, There were also no signs that little Alex had been taken on a long trip, and no indication of a struggle or robbery. At the State Police Barracks garage, evidence technicians processed Joann's car. They hoped something left behind could lead them closer to the missing mother and child. On the headrest of the driver's seat, they found 6 dirty blonde hairs. One was partially smeared with a dark red substance, maybe blood. But nothing immediately pointed to Joann and Alex's whereabouts. As lead investigator, Trooper Bob Egan was suspicious of the way the car had been found.
There were a couple things that led Andy Katrinak to believe that his wife did not back that car, and number one is that she never used that parking lot to park her vehicle. They had a parking lot in back of their house, and number two, she never backed the car in. When she parked into a parking space, she always pulled in front of the vehicle first. She was very bad at backing up.
3 days had passed since Andy's wife and son disappeared. His parents posted flyers throughout his neighborhood and in Catasauqua's shopping district.
Tell me, have you seen this woman or the baby?
Anywhere Joann and Alex might have
Sorry, I
visited.
have not.
This is a picture of our daughter-in-law. This is our grandchild.
With still no word from Joann or a kidnapper, troopers delved further into Andy's background.
Anything like that? No, I just got
They found him anxious when he spoke of his former days as a semi-pro boxer in Las Vegas.
You guys have breakfast together? No,
He was good with his fists and earned his living as an instructor when he first moved to Pennsylvania. Now a private contractor, Andy barely made enough to pay the bills. A wife, a house, and a baby strained the new father's resources.
Yeah.
Troopers asked to see his financial records, including insurance documents, bank statements, and phone records.
I got some checks.
He told them that his wife had only minimal life insurance.
I know you probably would have wanted phone records, so I brought that down too.
On the day she disappeared with his son, Andy said he had been with his father, building a room addition for a client who lived a few miles from his home. Troopers were not satisfied. They suspected he may have still been hiding something. They demanded that Andy take a polygraph test.
Right now, do you know where your wife is located?
No, I don't.
The first test showed that Andy had not been deceptive regarding his family's disappearance. But investigators needed to be sure,
No.
Did you
so they
kill
tested him
Joann?
again.
No, I didn't.
The results were conclusive.
No.
Andy was telling the truth about his missing wife and baby.
Are you intentionally
Investigators
withholding
cleared
any
the husband
information
as a
about their
suspect.
disappearance?
No, I'm not.
By now, Joann and Alex had been missing for 4 days, and investigators still had no solid leads. Whether it had been a desertion or an abduction, it was possible the woman and child had crossed state lines. On December 19, 1994, state police called on the FBI for help. Special Agent Dave Rowe from the FBI's Allentown office joined the effort.
We began our investigation by identifying, locating, and interviewing virtually all of the relatives, virtually all of the friends, former work colleagues, anybody and everybody who was either related to or acquainted with Andy, Joann, and Alex.
Hands open. Coffee? Yes, thank you.
Local, state, and federal agencies funneled their resources into the search for the missing woman and child. 6 days before Christmas, it seemed as if they had vanished without a trace. Joann Katrinak, a 26-year-old mother, and her 4-month-old son, Alex, had mysteriously disappeared from their Catasauqua, Pennsylvania home. Her husband, Andy, had been cleared of suspicion. Now investigators traveled across Pennsylvania state lines to question Joann's ex-husband, who lived and worked in New Jersey. Mike Jack had married Joann in 1991. They were divorced just a few months later, amidst allegations that Jack was abusive. Maybe Joann had decided to rekindle the relationship. Or perhaps her ex had come to win her back. But investigators found Jack had a solid alibi for the date of Joann's disappearance. Agents also pursued people from Andy's past,
What are you doing here?
Well,
including his ex-girlfriend, Pat Rohrer.
December 14th.
Anything wrong?
An FBI agent interviewed Rohrer at her home in North Carolina.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I keep all
He
kinds
found
of
she too had a solid alibi for the day Joann and Alex had vanished.
I'll tell you what, I really appreciate that, man.
Okay.
Back in Catasauqua, investigators returned to McCarty's Tavern, where Joann's car had been found the day she had disappeared. Maybe someone had noticed her, or whoever had parked the car. Troopers and agents eventually interviewed everyone who had been at the bar that night, but no one had seen a thing.
You working last Thursday night? Yes, I was.
Investigators also canvassed the Katrinak neighborhood. One neighbor directed them to a handyman who rented a room down the street. He'd done repair work in several local homes. Detectives soon discovered he had a criminal record for breaking and entering. He seemed a promising suspect. He admitted to police he had had some run-ins with the law, but swore he had no knowledge of Joann and Alex's disappearance. He agreed to come in for further questioning. Investigators learned the handyman lived in a lean-to by a river near the Katrinak's house during the summer months. The state police canine team searched the shelter for any evidence that Joann and Alex had been there. They found nothing, and the handyman was cleared. Another dead end. For frustrated investigators, precious time slipped away as community concern grew.
Come in.
State Police Major Robert Wirtz helped establish hotlines to elicit the public's help.
There was obviously a lot of concerns in the community as to what occurred. So we had a command post set up here at the barracks with a number of telephone lines coming into the command post. Those phone numbers were given to the public, and we in fact did get information from the public.
Reports of sightings poured in. One resident reported seeing Joann with an unidentified man near railroad tracks behind the Katrinak's home. She was carrying a baby and seemed frightened by the man pulling her further into the brush against her will. In response, FBI agents and state police immediately conducted a massive line search of a 4-mile stretch near the railroad tracks. The search continued through the night. They scanned the area inch by inch as choppers circled overhead. But again, investigators found nothing. Trooper Joe Kosovar, now co-lead investigator with his partner Bob Egan, recalls that reports of sightings continued.
They saw her along the railroad tracks, they saw her on an airplane, they saw her in a convenience store with the baby, but none of them checked out. They were false leads, and apparently people who they saw and thought they saw were two different people.
Christmas passed and spring began, with still no word of Joann and Alex. Then on April 9th, a farmer was tilling his field in Heidelberg Township, 15 miles northwest of Catasauqua. he saw what looked like a pile of clothes at the field's edge. When he walked over to investigate, he encountered a horrifying sight. Human remains. Four months after the disappearance of Joann Katrinak and her infant son, Alex, a farmer found the decaying bodies of a mother and child at the edge of his Pennsylvania field. The FBI and troopers arrived immediately. Dental records would later confirm what they already suspected. The bodies were Alex and Joann Katrinak's. Joann lay on her back, a diaper bag still on her shoulder. She had been shot once in the head and beaten about the face. Alex was face down on his mother's stomach, dressed in the blue snowsuit he'd worn on his ill-fated trip to meet his grandmother. The bodies were 50 feet past the end of a trail that ran through the woods. Nearby, crime scene technicians found a baby bottle and a rattle. To Trooper Bob Egan, the location of the items was significant.
You could see items that had fallen to the ground almost in a sequence as if an assault started and Joann was walking or running away from the assault, and she was dropping items along the way.
It appeared the killer had driven up to the end of the trail, and from there had forced Joann to walk the remaining 50 feet. Evidence technicians would spend 15 hours searching the area, but they found no shell casings, fingerprints, footprints, or murder weapons. In the hopes that the forest debris might yield answers, they collected leaves and dirt from beneath the bodies and sent them to the police lab for closer examination. For Major Robert Wirtz and the others who'd worked the case for months, the finality of this brutal murder evoked a barrage of emotions.
When the bodies were found, there was a period of time there when it was very difficult for the officers that were assigned to this investigation. Took it very personally, and it was hard because I think they were holding out hope that, you know, she was going to be found alive.
With the mysterious disappearance officially deemed a homicide, the case remained under state jurisdiction. But the FBI never stopped actively assisting.
Hello, Linda. Dave Rowe here. The fact that somebody would abduct a new mother and a 4-month-old infant, everybody can identify with that. And once you become aware of that, you want to be part of the investigation.
An autopsy revealed that Joann had been shot once with a .22 caliber bullet and beaten 19 times with a blunt object. The fact that there had been 2 modes of attack was a telling clue for Trooper Joe Kosovar.
Based on the absence of empty shell casings and the fact that the victim had received 1 shot and numerous blows to the head, led me to believe that the gun malfunctioned.
The medical examiner was unable to determine exactly how baby Alex was killed, whether he'd been suffocated or left to die of exposure. Police continued to analyze the physical evidence found at the crime scene. To help build the case, they brought in prosecutor Mike McIntyre of the Lehigh County District Attorney's Office.
We found 2 more hairs that first match the 6 hairs found on that headrest in color and length.
But the hairs would have to be examined forensically to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they matched. A Pennsylvania State Police forensic scientist conducted the lab analysis. The results confirmed what investigators had suspected. The hairs belonged to the same person. And the substance on one of them was determined to be human blood, containing DNA consistent with Joann's. But to whom did the hairs belong? Tests quickly ruled out the Katrinaks and several of Joann's friends who had access to the car. Pennsylvania State Police were baffled.
How far are we on it?
Again, they turned to the FBI for help. The FBI sent a behavioral profiler from Washington, D.C. A profiler can help narrow the search for suspects by detailing the type of person responsible for a crime through that person's behavioral characteristics. Profilers study a variety of crime-related information, including case reports, geography, timing, and the victim's habits. Then they revisit the crime scenes to read the locations for clues to the killer's behavior. Investigators first took the profiler to the place the bodies were found. He would look for anything that might reveal the killer's signature. The area was so far from the abduction site, the profiler was convinced the killer had been here before. The profiler also hypothesized the killer had been male because the attack had been so brutal. The abduction had taken place in broad daylight, which offered another hint. The killer would be someone comfortable being seen in the small town of Catasauqua, and someone who perhaps knew the family's habits and the layout of the house. By fleshing out this portrait of the killer, the profiler gave investigators new direction in a frustrating case. But troopers needed a name that fit the profile. To find that name, troopers drove Andy around Heidelberg Township, close to where the bodies were found. They hoped to prompt his memory of someone who knew this rural area. They asked if Joann had ever visited here. Was there a friend or a family member who lived nearby? Andy could think of no one. Disappointed, investigators returned to State Police headquarters. Then, just as Andy was about to leave, he remembered something. He did know someone who knew Heidelberg Township, and also his home in Catasauqua. His ex-girlfriend, Pat Rohrer, had once managed a stable in Heidelberg.
And with that, he tells me that he couldn't tell me the exact place, what it was called, because he couldn't remember the name, but he could give me directions on how to get there. So I told him, I said, well, tell me. As he started to tell me the directions of how to get to where Patty Rohrer was boarding a horse and taking care of horses, well, I knew he was taking me right to the area where Joann and the baby were found.
We used to go together.
Pat Rohrer and Andy had lived together briefly in Pennsylvania. He told investigators he once visited her at the stable. But they'd broken up in 1989, and she had moved back to North Carolina.
How you been? Yeah? It's all right.
Then in the spring of 1991, before Andy met Joann, Rohrer had visited him unexpectedly after a fight with her most recent boyfriend. Andy was sympathetic. He let Rohrer stay for a few days, though their relationship remained purely a friendship.
Tell me about
Then she returned to North Carolina.
Fresno Road.
Not long after that, Andy met Joann.
We lived together for a while.
As he now told state troopers, it was love at first sight. They were married soon after, in the spring of 1993. They agreed they wanted children, and less than a year later, Joann was pregnant.
Hey, sweetie.
Hey, baby.
Alex was born in August of 1994.
That you think is so adorable? Yeah. You know, and I think it's...
Now Andy
he's
told
just telling
investigators about something that had happened 3 days before his wife and son disappeared.
I will. Hello?
On December 12th, Joann answered a phone call.
May I tell him his
It was Pat Rohrer.
Pat,
What does she want?
what do you think she wants?
Joann told Rohrer that Andy was married now and that they had a baby. She told Rohrer not to call again.
Please, don't
Then
call us.
Joann hung up on her.
I used to date a girl.
Though Andy knew Pat had a temper, he dismissed the idea that she might seek revenge.
Go together.
Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. A second mother and child were found brutally murdered. The pair, who resembled Joann and Alex, were discovered in a retail store dressing room in nearby Collegeville, Pennsylvania. Investigators now wondered if a serial killer was on the loose, preying on mothers and children in Pennsylvania. While investigating the homicide of Joann and Alex Katrinak, Pennsylvania State Police responded to another double murder in a retail store just 45 miles away. The victims were a second young mother and her baby. Police feared a serial killer was on the prowl. They quickly arrested the suspect, the store owner's son. While he confessed to this killing, he had an airtight alibi for the day Joann and Alex were slain. Now police turned their attention to Andy Katrinak's ex-girlfriend, Pat Rohrer.
Yeah, we got a couple things to run down.
Rohrer was a long shot, a brunette instead of a blonde, and a woman, though the profiler believed the murderer was male. But she was familiar with both the abduction and murder sites. Then Trooper Joe Kosovar recalled that he'd worked on a case that was strangely similar. He phoned Special Agent Dave Rowe.
Trooper Joe Kosovar recollected that he had investigated a homicide some years earlier where the cause of death was blunt force blows to the head. The assailant was determined to be a woman, while 4 blows by an adult male would produce the same damage that a woman might have to strike 15, 20, 25 blows to accomplish.
Joann Katrinak had sustained 19 blows. But could a woman have killed her and her infant as well? In May of 1995, 6 months after the murders, troopers Bob Egan and Joe Kosovar traveled to North Carolina. The FBI had helped coordinate a meeting with the Lexington County Sheriff's Office. Together, authorities from the 2 states would interview Pat Rohrer at her attorney's office. Rohrer's mother was also there.
You exercise subordination.
Rohrer expanded upon her original alibis. On December 15th, the day of the crime, she said she'd visited a local tanning salon. That evening, she'd taken her regular Thursday night dance lesson at the Cowboys Nightlife bar.
Why'd you guys split up?
Rohrer admitted she'd worked at the stable in Heidelberg Township, but said she hadn't been back to Pennsylvania since she'd visited Andy after the fight with her boyfriend. She also swore she'd never owned a gun. Lieutenant Tony Roberson of the Lexington County Sheriff's Department helped agents and troopers investigate her statements.
The first thing that they wanted to do was discredit her alibis to find out whether they could be corroborated or whether they could be found to be invalid.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Investigators
Hi.
visited the tanning
Please, couple
salon
questions.
Rohrer claimed to have used on the day of the murders.
Detective Kosovar, State Police.
Prosecutor Mike McIntyre remembers this alibi quickly proved false.
If you can get that for us.
The owner of the tanning salon, Mrs. Simerson, said, hey, you know what? Something's wrong here, because we were closed on that particular day that Pat Rohrer says she was in getting a tan, because that's my husband's birthday, and we were over at the shopping mart in some city about 50 miles away, and I remember that, and I have a receipt for you from the shopping mall to show that we were there.
Excuse me, sir.
At the Cowboys nightlife bar, the dance instructor knew Rohrer as a regular.
We're investigating a murder up in Pennsylvania, and we understand that
The club's sign-in sheet showed she'd been there the Thursday before December 15th and the Thursday after, but not on the 15th.
And she was there.
Investigators secured Rohrer's phone records. They showed she'd used the phone every day of December 1994, except from the 12th through the 15th. Despite her alibis, Rohrer could not prove she'd been in North Carolina on the day of the killings. More incriminating still, her police record revealed a history of violence.
She has violent tendencies, has had them in the past. She was charged in a neighboring county, in Forsyth County, of getting into a fight over a man at a bar. And she was arrested that night.
But investigators were still missing one key piece of evidence, the murder weapon. Rohrer continued to deny she'd ever owned a gun. But investigators kept digging. At a North Carolina stable, they found one of her ex-boyfriends, Walter Blaylock. He distinctly remembered that Rohrer had bought a handgun for $50 at a yard sale. It was a .22 caliber Jennings, which they had used for target shooting in Rohrer's backyard.
You put your hands on me, girl!
The last time he had seen it was during an intense argument.
Calm down, Pat! I'm not gonna calm down! Calm down! Don't do something foolish! Please! Settle down! Put a gun down!
Now Blaylock told Trooper Egan the gun had a curious flaw.
He went on to describe the handgun as being a junky piece of junk type of handgun that often after the first time you shot it, it jammed, not allowing you to fire a second shot. Now this fed into the theory why somebody would be shot once and then beaten about the head.
The FBI helped coordinate interstate efforts to secure a probable cause warrant to search Rohrer's North Carolina home for the murder weapon. They arrived with the warrant on July 24th, 1995.
Search your house, man. What are you doing here? I have a warrant.
Despite a thorough search, they didn't find the gun. But they did find numerous spent .22 caliber shell casings in the backyard.
State Police. Detective Egan, Detective Kosovar, ma'am.
Only when police told Rohrer that they knew she owned a handgun did she admit to it.
This gun in my house.
But she insisted Blaylock had taken it with him when he'd moved out about a month before the murders.
No, I have not.
Why did you buy the gun?
I told you.
The case against Rohrer was
with
growing,
him, but I do not
but it
have
was
this
built
gun,
on
okay?
circumstantial evidence.
Just because he wanted this gun.
Did you get it? She could have dumped it.
And strangely, the only physical evidence, the hairs from the car and the murder site, didn't seem to fit. The hairs were dirty blonde. Rohrer's hair was brown. Trooper Joe Kosovar wondered if it could have been dyed at the time of the killings. He learned that shortly before the murders, Rohrer had ridden in a rodeo competition and won. Kosovar contacted the event organizers, hoping they'd taken a photo of her. His inquiry paid off. They sent him the photo. As he'd guessed, Rohrer's hair was dirty blonde.
The photograph was given to our crime lab personnel, and they compared the color of the photograph of the hair with the color of the hairs that were found in the vehicle, and decided that they should further investigate those hairs.
Detectives obtained a warrant to collect blood and hair samples from Pat Rohrer. If evidence analysts could match her hair to those from Joann's car on the murder site, the troopers could make their arrest. But they would need to rely on a test so new that it would take more than a year for the test to be approved. Until then, the prime suspect of the double murder would remain free. After an investigation that had lasted almost a year, detectives had a strong suspect in the double murder of Joann Katrinak and her infant son, Alex. With a search warrant, they obtained blood and hair samples from Pat Rohrer, the former girlfriend of Joann's husband, Andy. Rohrer was now pregnant with the child of her current boyfriend. Forensic scientists would attempt to match her hair samples with hair found at the crime scenes. The Pennsylvania State Police Lab determined Rohrer's hairs were microscopically consistent with the recovered hairs. But investigators needed more proof, a match at the cellular level. They extracted Rohrer's DNA sequence from her blood samples and attempted to compare it with the DNA and hairs from the crime scenes. But there was a problem making a match. Joseph DeZino, Unit Chief at the DNA Analysis Unit 2 at the FBI lab, explains.
When hairs are found at a crime scene, they're normally naturally shed hairs that don't have much tissue upon the root. And if they don't have much tissue upon the root, there's very, very little DNA contained in those hairs. And therefore, our experience has shown us that nuclear DNA analysis will fail.
In this case, only one of the hairs found at the crime scene contained enough skin tissue necessary for nuclear DNA analysis. But there was a great risk. To conduct the test, examiners would have to destroy that sample. If the test was inconclusive, there was no way to repeat the process. They needed a way to test the other hairs that held no skin tissue. A possible solution lay in a new process being pioneered by the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. Mitochondrial DNA testing.
This was brand new. To my knowledge, this was the first forensics laboratory in the United States to bring this new analysis online.
Because the test was so new, it would take more than a year to be certain the results could be scientifically reliable. Mitochondrial DNA testing uses the DNA contained in the cell's mitochondria, or organelles. Since there is more mitochondrial DNA than nuclear DNA in hair cells, it is easier for examiners to retrieve the mitochondrial DNA. With 5 hair samples to test, examiners could repeat the test and obtain more reliable results.
With mitochondrial DNA analysis, we're over 90% successful obtaining DNA from hairs that are naturally shed, hairs without root. And we only need about 1 inch of hair in order to obtain a result, generally speaking.
To attempt a mitochondrial DNA match, first the DNA sequence in a hair cell's mitochondria is isolated. Then its sequence is plotted and compared to the suspect's known DNA sequence, in this case taken from Pat Rohrer's blood cells. Both DNA sequences matched. Forensic scientist Joseph DeZino explains what that meant.
If a hair from a crime scene is found to have the same mitochondrial DNA type as a blood sample from a suspect, our reports state that that suspect cannot be excluded as a source of that hair from the crime scene. Therefore, Patricia Rohrer could not be excluded as a source of these hairs.
However, without nuclear DNA confirmation, the result was not absolutely conclusive. Now scientists examined the hair sample with skin for a nuclear DNA match. It corroborated the mitochondrial match. There was no question that Patricia Rohrer had left those hairs behind. It was a pivotal moment in the case. In the early morning of June 24th, 1997, investigators arrived at Rohrer's home with an arrest warrant.
Pat Rohrer, I've got a warrant for your arrest. I need you to come with us, ma'am, please.
Yes?
Deputy, go with him.
The female detective followed Rohrer upstairs to keep an eye on her as she dressed herself and her 18-month-old daughter. It seemed a routine safety precaution, but it yielded some of the most damaging evidence in the case.
During the time that Pat was trying to settle her baby down and get dressed, the female detective, Suzanne Pearson, was present in the bedroom. And it was at this time that she overheard a conversation that Pat Rohrer had with her baby. Pat's baby's name is Nicole, and what the detective overheard was Pat Rohrer saying to Nicole, Nicole, if I would have known I was going to get caught, I would have never brought you into this world. It was something that Suzanne Pearson, the detective, documented as soon as possible, and this was very damaging.
More than 3 years after the murder of Joann Katrinak and her baby, Pat Rohrer was finally under arrest. She was flown to Pennsylvania to face murder charges. Preparing for trial, prosecutors pieced together the terrifying events of Joann and Alex Katrinak's last day. On December 15, 1994, Pat Rohrer had broken into the basement of the Katrinak's home, knowing Andy was out and Joann was alone with Alex. Joann had no idea Rohrer was downstairs as she called her mother-in-law and packed up baby Alex for a shopping trip.
Right.
From the basement, Rohrer heard every word Joann said.
All right, I'll see you in a bit. Bye.
And she remembered the house from a visit with Andy 3 years earlier. She knew where to look for the 2 phone lines and which one to cut so Joann couldn't call for help. Joann carried Alex outside, still unaware that Pat was in the house. Rohrer heard Joann leave and went outside to catch up with her. Joann didn't see Rohrer sneak up behind her, carrying a .22 caliber Jennings.
Oh, get in the car. Oh my God. Get in the car.
Rohrer jumped into the back seat with the baby and forced Joann to drive. Joann must have been terrified as she drove with Rohrer's gun at her head, afraid for herself, and more so for her helpless 4-month-old baby. Rohrer directed Joann to an obscure horse trail in Heidelberg Township. As Rohrer forced her further into the woods, Joann in her terror dropped Alex's rattle and then his bottle. Rohrer fired once, but then her gun jammed, and she began bludgeoning Joann. She may have suffocated baby Alex, or simply left him to die slowly of exposure to the December elements. Then Rohrer parked the car at McCarty's Tavern and fled from Pennsylvania. Prosecutors built an airtight case, using evidence investigators had meticulously collected. It was a concerted effort by many in law enforcement, unwilling to let this woman and child perish in silence.
As investigators, we have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to be the voice of the victim, is to gather the information and speak for the victims that can no longer speak.
Close 6.
The jury found Pat Rohrer guilty of 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Legally, the case was closed, and for the town of Catasauqua, the mystery was solved. If not for the advanced forensic technology of the FBI, this brutal double murderer might still be free.